Do you think violent revolution can come to America? And what do you think of pacifism? Well, could it come to America? Sure, but you really don't want it to. Anyone who's ever lived through a violent revolution will tell you how awful it is. And if you're a serious Marxist, you should not advocate a violent revolution. You should advocate a peaceful transition. You should have the understanding that a violent revolution may happen, but it will happen because the ruling class forces it. The ruling class demands it. The ruling class won't allow a peaceful transition. But you should want a peaceful transition. You should not advocate a violent revolution, right? And as far as nonviolence, pacifism is concerned, look, I will say this, and no one ever points this out. Pacifists are some of the most heroic and bold people ever. Pacifism means you will not inflict violence. That's what it means. Doesn't mean you won't receive violence. Doesn't mean you won't put yourself in harm's way and risk. And a lot of people that say they're pacifists, they engage in nonviolence, don't get themselves arrested. Don't do heroic militant things. That's not pacifism. Pacifism is a moral stance, usually justified by religion, Quakerism, Buddhism, or whatever, that they themselves will never inflict violence, even in the form of self-defense. That's what it means. Fine. But, Quakers, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Buddhists, and others, some of those people, during the Vietnam War, there were pacifists who blocked the train tracks for troop trains. There was a guy who lost both of his legs because he and thousands of other Vietnam War protesters sat on the tracks to block train tracks that were sending soldiers to Vietnam. And this guy didn't get out of the way and quick enough, and he lost both of his legs. Now, those people were pacifists, but you can't say those people weren't brave. You can't say they weren't heroic. You can't say they didn't take risks, that they just had a moral feeling that they will never inflict violence. And that's really important, because I'm really tired of people saying they're pacifists, and that's a justification for not doing anything, right? That pacifism doesn't mean you don't take risks. Pacifism doesn't mean, I gotcha. Pacifism doesn't mean you don't make sacrifices. Pacifism doesn't mean you're not confrontational. Pacifists can be very confrontational, right? There's that quote from Mario Savio, who was the leader of the free speech movement at Berkeley. And he said, there comes a time where the operation of the machine becomes so odious that you can't even passively take part, that you've got to throw yourself on the gears and on the wheels. And you got to make clear to those who run it and those who own it that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from running at all. That's pacifism. Plenty of pacifist people have occupied factories. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was a pacifist. He had no problem occupying lunch counters. And his followers would go into those lunch counters and sit there. And those lunch counters that refused to serve black people, and they would sit there until the police dragged them away. They weren't inflicting violence, but they were being confrontational. They were going into someone else's store, sitting down and saying, you won't serve me because I'm black. Well, I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to get up. And I'm going to disrupt your business, and that is very different than, pacifism is not the same as being passive. Pacifism is not the same as being non-confrontational. One can be a pacifist and be very confrontational. One can be a pacifist and be very defiant and rebellious and resistive. And that's what people need to understand. And that, being a pacifist in and of itself does not mean that one is not willing to take great risks and take great sacrifices, to be very disruptive and all that. It just means one takes a moral, religious stance against any inflicting of pain on somebody else. And that's the important thing to remember. And that it's widely misunderstood. So I think that that's an important point that needs to be made. So yeah, there you go. And you're asking me, is nonviolent revolution possible? I don't have a crystal ball. I will tell you this much, right? Read my new book. I talk about how there is a layer within the United States that is becoming almost like a national bourgeoisie that is against what the global financial order is doing and has a financial interest in aligning with Russia and China, that ultimately is going to come into confrontation with the rest of the ruling class of the United States. and that is going to need the working class to have their back. And there are going to be Bonapartist struggles within the ruling class. And the basis for a real anti monopoly coalition is forming. And would it be possible for this anti monopoly coalition to take power peacefully? I think so. But would it be able to then hold on to power? Would the coalition last, or what would happen after that? I don't know. But is it possible that we could have an anti monopoly president elected? At some point in the future, I think that is possible. I think is that if the US economy continues to get worse, as the capitalists begin fighting among themselves, um, I think it's likely that some kind of military, someone within the military will emerge who wants to make the US economy get better, and would run on a platform of fixing the US economy, and would be wanting to make deals with Russia and China to fix the US economy. I think that's very likely. Now, that person, in order to get into office, would have to build up a lot of support among the working class. They'd have to mobilize the population to have their back. And I think it's possible that we could have a Bonapartist, someone who's like Trump, but not like Trump, someone who's much more of an anti-imperialist than Trump and much more of a populist than Trump take power. I think that's possible. Would they be able to stay in power? That's the question. Um, you know, but I think it's very possible that some kind of Bonapartist who wants the U.S. economy to grow and breaks with the big monopolies in order to do so could get elected. I think that's very possible. And it would have to come from within the power structure, probably within the military. But then when they took office, would they be able to implement their program? Would their coalition fracture? Would I don't know, but is it possible that we could have a an anti-monopoly coalition take power, get elected in the United States? Based on the balance of forces, I think it is possible.